Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we continue the story of probably the most famous plot and attempt to kill Hitler, the 20th of July plot of 1944. Hi, Jesse. Here we are, another week, yet again another podcast. The 20th of July, number 2, because
Indeed.
Last time, so I think we got carried away and as always, went down all sorts of rabbit holes and tangents and this and that and the other. So we have another, I want to say fun-packed, but that probably is the wrong word, isn't it? Episode in front of us. I think that is
Fascinating.
That's probably better rather than fun-packed. I think you're absolutely right. That wasn't very clever. Probably I shouldn't have said that, dear listeners. But there we are. It's action-packed, whatever. Dear listeners, you know what we mean. You know what we mean. So, Jesse, where do we pick up the story? Where do we start and where do we go with this? Well, in the end, there's a bomb going off. That's for sure. But where do we start now today?
All roads lead to the wolf's lair in East Prussia in this case. But to catch up our listeners from the previous episode, we basically talked about the genesis of this network of resistant officers and generals in the German military. Where do they come from? Many of them, but not all, but many of them are aristocrats. They have a sort of baked-in historical antagonism with the Nazis, who are this new revolutionary party that kind of take away some of the prestige, some of the influence of this aristocratic class. There are people who are very often quite conservative with authoritarian ideas about how society should be organized. They're nationalistic. They want Germany to remain a great power, to keep some of its conquered territory. But they have a value system that doesn't jive with the Nazi value system. They want more of the rule of law. They want some kind of basis of truthfulness in the public life of a future Germany. They don't want this mass indiscriminate killing of civilians to continue. And they have this vision of some sort of different Germany that's not fully open, liberal, democratic, but that is not Nazi. And they want to continue fighting against the Soviets, but negotiate with the Western allies and stop the war with the Western allies in the hopes of preserving a powerful German state and preventing a Soviet invasion of Germany. They are pushed into action by these ideas, but also by the situation in 1944, which becomes catastrophic with the crushing defeat of Army Group Center in the East in June and July, and of course then the looming defeat in Normandy that's clear that it's coming in July 1944 as well. That is a very, very shortened version of a lot of the stuff that we talked about in our last episode. And where we want to sort of get the ball rolling for this episode, we've talked about some of the individuals involved. We talked about General Beck, who was supposed to be the head of state if this plot had succeeded. Of course, we talk about the most famous name, Stauffenberg. We mentioned Tresco quite a few times, another general who is kind of the mastermind in a way behind the plan. He does a lot of the writing, the development, the pragmatic planning of it. But Matthias is our resident expert on the individual stories. So who are these people, not as a group, but now also as individuals? And I'll let you take it from there.
Well, maybe we jump right in it and plunge into it and we talk about obviously the most famous, perhaps the most important one, definitely the most famous actor in this entire story. And that, of course, is, you've already mentioned the name. And dear listeners, you probably have heard the name before. You might have seen the film. You might have seen Tom Cruise. And that, of course, is Stauffenberg. It's actually quite scary because I think Tom Cruise looks a little bit like Stauffenberg. There's some similarity there. His German isn't all that great, but that's okay. So
It never
Stauffenberg,
is.
there we go. Stauffenberg, as we know him, with his whole name, Klaus Philipp Maria Justinian Schenk Graf von Stauffenberg. That's a good name. That's far too long. That's why we just call him Stauffenberg. There we are. The name already gives it away. Of course, he's a member of the aristocracy. In a previous episode, we talked about the legacy that comes with this, the worldview, self-esteem, your perceived position in the state, all these things. And of course, he is born into this. So he's born into the German nobility. He's born in 1907, so he's actually quite young. And he joins the German army after, obviously, the First World War. He joins a cavalry regiment, as you should with that name, because that's what you do, because that's the prestigious regiments, the famous Bamberger Reiter in his particular case. And then 1930 becomes a lieutenant, or for American friends, a lieutenant, you can choose. And he then basically rises through the ranks and does whatever you do. And in 1939, of course, the war breaks out. He takes part in the campaign against Poland. And this is where he has some really interesting nationalistic ideas. Again, I think in the last episode, we briefly talked about this. So he writes home and says something on the lines of, well, it's good that we're here. Well, we need to rule Poland. It's all German territory and what have you. And this then of course, changes as the war progresses. But it takes some time because he's then in France. He fights on the Eastern Front as well. So he's in 1942, he's sent to Berlin to the OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, which is interesting because at that stage, it's not in central Berlin, it's in the outskirts of Berlin, a place called Zossen, which is to the south or southeast of Berlin. Dear listeners, go there. I think I might have mentioned it in a previous episode. There, it's fascinating to see. You still have the bunkers of the OKH, so the army headquarters. You can see the bunker where Operation Barbarossa was planned. The Soviets tried to blow it up after the war. You can still see things. You've got what was in those days the world's largest communication bunker. You can see I'm getting carried away because it's a fascinating place. It's really good.
It's very cool.
It is very cool. And after World War II, it became the headquarters of the Soviet forces, a forbidden city where 50,000 people lived, completely cordoned off and detached from reality and the German civilian population. I digress, as always. Here's another tangent. Just make sure you go to Zossen. It is important because Hitler hated the place. He never went there, not once, because he spoke of the spirit of Zossen. And by that he meant the world of the old elite, the nobility, the general staff officers. And of course, Stauffenberg, he's von Stauffenberg, he of course fits this bill rather nicely in Hitler's view. So you can see that there are these tensions there. So Stauffenberg then serves on the OKH. That's where he also goes to the east and sees a few things, first of all, related to warfare, but also to atrocities. And this is where we know from his writings, we know from reports from friends and other people that his views are beginning to change. Because he says what's going on there, what is done there in the name of Germany is so fundamentally wrong, we must stop this. He's then sent to North Africa, where if you have seen, of course, the famous opening scene, which apparently I was told was refilmed. So the Stauffenberg film, if you haven't seen the film, dear listeners, it opens with the scene in North Africa where Stauffenberg is severely wounded. Apparently, if you know more about this, please correct me if I'm wrong. Apparently, when the film was shown first as a trial to the audience, that scene wasn't there, and people complained because there weren't enough explosions in the film. Because there's only one, because that's when the bomb goes off, and everyone says it's a war film.
Movie.
It's a war movie, so we need to have things exploding. So apparently, I'm not quite sure if it's true. That was then redone and put in. Ask Tom Cruise whether it's true or not. I'm not entirely sure. But that, of course, is where he gets severely wounded, and he loses one hand, loses a number of fingers on the other hand, and one eye. He's then sent back to Germany, basically just to get better. And when that happens in 1943, in September 1943, he's then sent to Berlin because he's no longer fit for frontline service. And he becomes the chief of staff of the Ersatzheer. And that is basically, the literal translation is replacement army. And replacement army, that doesn't sound terribly exciting, but in many ways, that was one of the most, perhaps the most important part of the army, because everything that's not in the operational area and on the front line came under the Ersatzheer. So this is basically all the training institutions that you find in Germany. So it's huge. So when you look at the sheer numbers, this part of the army was probably one of the, well, not probably, was one of the largest ones. So really, really quite important. That's where he becomes the chief of staff. And that is in central Berlin, in what is now called Stauffenbergstraße, strangely enough. So the street is named after him. And those days, it was called the Bendler Block, or Bendlerstraße. And the building is called, even today, the building is called the Bendler Block, which now houses the Ministry of Defense. This had been part of the army headquarters in World War II. Before that, it had been part of the Navy High Command in the First World War. So it's always been a very military place. Dear listeners, again, if you're interested in these things, and I hope you are, because that's why you're listening to us, go to the Bendler Block. There's now a museum dedicated to German resistance, and you can still see Stauffenberg's office in there. And just one other point before I hand over, because I know I've been rambling on for quite some time again. Just one aspect which I find interesting, and I hope, dear listeners, you do as well. Otherwise, you just have to endure the next 2 or 3 minutes, because it is a bit of a tangent, but only a small one. When Stauffenberg is young, so before the Second World War, so when he's about 14, 15, he's introduced to a very interesting person who becomes really important to his life. And this is a chap called Stefan George. Stefan George, probably, dear listeners, you haven't heard of him. To Stauffenberg, he was an extremely important person. So this Stefan George is a bit of a weird and strange human being, to be perfectly honest. So he is a writer, a bit of an artist, and he comes with all sorts of really interesting ideas about nationhood and state and what is Germany. And so he has some sort of transcendental ideas about what a state and what Germany means. And the slogan for this, so a Germany that you can't really pin down. So what is Germany? He said that you can't do this because it's all about the spirit. Going back very much in this German tradition of the 19th and 18th century, so Germany as the land of the thinkers, the poets and thinkers, as the slogan was in those days. And he says that's exactly, and he calls that the Geheime Deutschland, so the secret Germany. And this is super influential and important for Stauffenberg, because he becomes basically, you might say, a big fan. So he goes on what you might call pilgrimages to this guy, where he sits and they read poems together. He writes a number of poems in the same really confusing and confused style. So when I read them in German, I've got no idea what he's talking about, this guy, this George, because it is confusing. But to Stauffenberg, that was really important. And this idea of this transcendental Germany, all about values, about ideas, is one of the factors, lots of people have argued, why he then changes his mood in 1942, particularly 43, to say, no, there must be a better Germany, because sacred Germany, as they would have said in those days. Sorry, not secret, not sacred, I'll come back in a minute. Secret Germany. This is something different, and this is better than what you find in the Nazi state at this particular moment. And why did I mix up secret and sacred now? Because there is, towards the very end, I'm jumping ahead now. So when Stauffenberg gets shot in the Bendler Block in the very early hours of the 21st of July, he's brought forward. We can talk about the actual episode in a bit more detail later on. Just before he is about to get shot, he shouts out, and there are two different stories about this. And some people heard that he shouted, "Long live sacred Germany," because that's something you do as a German army officer. That makes perfect sense. There are other people who claim and have written and said, no, he shouted out, "Long live secret Germany." And people were very confused about this until later on people made this connection to the Georgikreis. Bit of a tangent, but I think it's quite important to set this context, to think a little bit about Stauffenberg's thinking. What does Germany mean? It links a little bit also to the whole debate about the oath that we had last time. That's me done. I need to catch my breath. Jesse, I'm just going to throw it over to you again, because I've been talking for quite some time. Take it apart. Any comments? Anything you think that was completely barking, or what do you think?
Well, it's interesting. This is a theme that comes. I'm continuing the tangent, by the way, so there's no respite.
Very good.
No respite from the tangents, or respite from the tangents. I suppose this idea of romanticism in Germany, and is it something that brings values and aspirations for a better society, or is it something that divorces people from reality, that leads to nightmarish extremes of what they think is a sort of utopia, but what in fact becomes the Nazis and so on. There were a lot of strange thinkers in the 1920s as well who toyed with these different ideas, futurists and so on. But it made me think of this one German thinker, Werner Sombart, I think his name was. And I remember reading an excerpt of his work one time where he was talking about this spirit that should be Germany, right? Where he says, yes, it's this and it's spiritual and it's people united and anybody can participate. And he was a bit open about that. He didn't say, only sort of German blood or whatever in this excerpt anyway. He said, it's a kind of a mindset. Being German is like a state of being spiritually, right? If you are connecting with these ideas. And he's like, and then he goes on to say, and the purpose of this German spirit is to fight the Jewish spirit. And I was just like, oh man, here we go.
You just lost it there, yes.
So you can see again how these ideas, like oaths, can be, and like history, can be pulled in different directions. And one of the things that I like and find interesting about many of the protagonists here, and Stauffenberg in particular, is that he could have interpreted those ideas in different ways. Many Germans of his generation did. But he interpreted them in a way that is, in many respects, admirable and morally defensible. So that was my little German spirit anecdote. To give Matthias time to catch his breath, do we want to talk about Tresco? From what I've read, he is one of the masterminds of the whole thing, and yet he's not as famous as Stauffenberg. He's not got that sort of prestige that Beck had at the time, right? Because Beck was going to be the head of state. Tresco was going to be in the government, but I think he was going to be the head of the Minister of Police or something along those lines. But from what I've read, there's been some documents that came out about 20 years ago that had been held by the Soviets that give Tresco the primary role. Now, you can correct me, Matthias, if I'm off track here, but as far as I understand, the latest sort of state of things is that Tresco gets not enough credit for developing the plan, for starting, for expanding this network, getting people on board. You mentioned, I think, his secretary or wife makes an appearance in the movie, jotting down the plans. Well, actually, his wife and secretary did help with the documentation, not in the way depicted in the movie, of course.
Not the deep dark woods, exactly. Yes,
right.
that was my point.
Shell in Belarus or whatever. So I think he's an interesting character, even though, listeners, I'm about to learn as much as you are about the rest of Tresco, because he's not a figure that I know very well.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, everything you said is absolutely spot on. So he is, particularly in the early days, or in the planning stage, he is one of perhaps the key figure. Maybe the problem, if that is the right word here, or the issue with his legacy and why we don't really see him that much and remember him that much, is because he was not in Berlin on the 20th of July. So we talked about him very, very briefly in the previous episode. So he is a Fon, so we talked about what this means, so I don't have to repeat all of this. He's extremely well connected. So he marries the daughter of Falkenhayn, the chief of the general staff, so to speak, the OHL in the First World War. And again, I said that last time. I think, dear listeners, if you want to hear more about the First World War, listen to our sister podcast. That's not what we are doing here. We are World War II historians on this podcast. And
we have to remind ourselves of that.
We have to remind ourselves, otherwise we get carried away and talk about Frederick the Great again, who's neither First World War nor Second World War. But there we are. And so after the First World War, he joins the Infantry Regiment Number 9, which is again, I've explained in the last episode, in the German context, really, really important. because in the small army that you have after the First World War, this regiment carries on and over the tradition of the Prussian Guards. So you have a very high density of very, very, not high ranking, but very well connected people, because they all come from the nobility. And you can see how the old conservative network, for a better term, still very much exists. And it's really is centered in and around this particular regiment. So when you look at pretty much every conservative politician of the Weimar Republic, or also the early Nazi years, 85% of them would have served in the Guards or perhaps in that particular regiment. So you can see some really interesting links. And then, of course, he stays in the army, as already said. He then has a relatively normal military career. And where it gets interesting for us is then on the Eastern Front. So he is actually involved in some of these atrocities against the Jews. There is, that you might say, is the shadow. And I think you said that, Jesse, already, probably in the last episode, a number of these people who then changed their minds and tried to do the good thing were involved in doing not so good things at the very beginning. And that also then set in motion this thought process. And he's involved in one of two of these things. One of these actions is, for example, the so-called Heu-Aktion, that's the hay action, which originally was planned by Himmler. And that was basically the idea to abduct unaccompanied Polish and Ukrainian children. So you can see there's all sorts of nasty stuff going on as well. And so he's involved in this because he at that stage is the chief of staff of the Second Army. And he signs the order, and that's on the 28th of June 1944 to conduct this. So you can see there's all sorts of stuff going on. And that's, of course, now very close to the 20th of July. Now you might say, why is he doing this? Is it because he's still convinced that's the right thing to do? Or is it because, well, he's still in this position, isn't he? So he needs to, for a better term, he needs to play the game. But you can see he's part of that particular machine, and he knows he's part of that particular machine. And in some ways, the advantage that he has is, of course, that he is there on the Chief of Staff of Army Group Center, the Second Army, because that's in the center of the Eastern Front. That's where lots of things are happening. That's where lots of visitors coming through. There's one episode where Hitler visits as well, and that's where they try to blow him up, putting a bomb on the plane, which doesn't go off. But lots of other people come and go all the time as well. There was a constant stream of visitors trying to learn about the fighting on the Eastern Front, how are things going, and what have you. So even though he's sitting over there, he has a very well-established network that he can still foster. So that is a very, very important thing. But then he stays there. He stays where he is on the 20th of July because that's his position, and he can't just get away. He can't just be sent back or fly back to Berlin. His position is too important. It would be too obvious. And once the operation is started, there's no real point in him going there anymore. But again, he would have played a very, very important role. And if I'm not mistaken, I always need to look this up. I think he was supposed to become the defense minister, but I would have to double check this.
I thought it was police, but listeners, you can let us know in the comments. Was it
exactly?
war?
Let us know.
Was it defense or was it police?
I can't always remember. I had to look over to my notes. I always mix this one up, but there we go. And of course, what is quite tragic about him is so when he then sits there on the Eastern Front in his headquarters, and he hears the messages, and he's then officially informed on the radio that Hitler has survived. And a small clique of criminal officers, as the official wording was of that note that was sent out in the evening of the 20th of July to the German people. He then sees, okay, you know what, the game's up. I'm going to be tortured, executed, and what have you. So he then decides to go into the woods, takes a hand grenade, and blows himself up. So, I mean, that's a very nasty way to go. But of course, he knew what would have happened otherwise, because what happens to the people who were captured and not executed on the spot was very, very gruesome. But we'll get to that story later on, I guess. So, in a nutshell, that's Tresco for you. In some ways, you might say a model for and off a lot of these conspirators because of his background and his actions and what he'd done in the war beforehand, and then this the change of view, the change of, well, mood is the wrong word, but aspiration, whatever word you want to use, trying to do something against Hitler. We could go on, but I think that's probably enough on this particular person. Otherwise, we have a whole episode just on Tresco. we're already 25 minutes in, and we only scratch the surface when it comes to Stauffenberg and some other people. There are more, of course. That's this thing. Anything I've forgotten when we talk about Tresco?
Oh, well, I'm not the best person to say that, because, as I say, I'm in the process of learning more about him along with our listeners here. Do you have one or maybe two more individuals you want to talk to us about before we move to what's the plan, the lead up to the plan, and then, how the whole thing actually shakes down?
Well, maybe just very brief, because again, otherwise we'll be here forever. Maybe just one or two of the famous ones who are also in Berlin at that particular time. And again, dear listeners, if you're an expert on the story, well, forgive me, I'm not going to cover all of them, because again, it would take forever. But one person who is very, very important is he's a general. And again, kind of, you might say, normal career in the early stages. So he's born in 1888. So that makes him comparatively old by the standards or by the group, because all the other people are much younger. As I already said, Stauffenberg is born in 1907. Normal military career after the First World War. Then does all sorts of things you need to do in the interwar period. And in Poland, he then commands an infantry division. That's the 24th Infantry Division. And he's actually awarded the Knight's Cross. So that's very early on. So you can see he was a very efficient military commander and military leader. And on the 15th of February 1940, he's then promoted to full general. So that's a very impressive career for someone we don't really know, apart from his role in the 20th of July plot. Before that, he doesn't really play a role. It's not like he's like Rommel or something like this. No one's ever heard the name, with the exception of this particular context of the 20th of July. And what's then important is that he's then appointed chief of the General Army Office, which is the Allgemeine Heeresamt, and that is in the Army High Command. And he actually sits in the Bendler block, and that's what he does. It's basically a desk job, obviously. And he was also made chief of the Armed Forces Reserve Office, the Wehrersatzamt. So this way, get all the new guys in when they get trained, and that's in the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. So he sits in Berlin, and he has this particular position, and he also joins this group of conspirators, of course, obviously. And what is interesting when you then look at the connection to Stauffenberg. So again, it's Tresco who is kind of meddling the water, so to speak. So he's looking at this and say, here's a Stauffenberg. We more or less won him over for our cause. He's going to get sent to Berlin somewhere because he's no longer fit for frontline service. Where can we place him? And he's then placed in this office under Olbricht. So Olbricht is actually the far more senior officer. Stauffenberg at that stage is a colonel. So Olbricht is one of the most senior officers that you find in this area. There are lots of other ones. Von Heffen, for example, is another player that you find here. Other people that you find in the Berlin circle. But maybe another one we could mention that might be of interest is Fellgiebel. Fellgiebel is an interesting character because he is the head of the signals service, so to speak. And that makes him very, very important when it comes to the situation in East Prussia, where everything is happening. So the moment a bomb goes off, he then severs all the communications between the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, that's where the plot takes place, Hitler's headquarters, and Berlin. And so the idea is that you completely cut them off regardless of what happens, so they're out of the picture. And one of the big problems, and again, we can talk about this in more detail as we go through this episode, one of the big problems is that not all lines are really cut and severed. So it's still possible to communicate between Rastenburg, so East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, and Berlin. And this is exactly what happens. And you might argue, perhaps, that this is the beginning of the end of this entire plot. The moment Hitler rings back to Berlin and says, no, I'm still alive, the mood, of course, in Berlin completely shifts and changes in all sorts of directions. But we need to talk a little bit about the plan itself before we go there. As I said, there are many others, but I think maybe these few might perhaps do for the moment before we return to the protagonist, to good old Stauffenberg, and talk about his actions.
So you can see, folks, or you can hear that historians are not natural filmmakers. We've just given out all sorts of spoilers about the main event that's coming up on this episode. But Olbricht, I also think, is an interesting figure. I don't know much about him outside of this plot, which is typical, of course. But he has a role to play in administering and communicating with the Ersatzheer, this replacement army. And that's a key. The replacement army is a key aspect of the plan. So I think I'll start to introduce some elements of the planning, and we can kind of go from there. So this group believes that the Gestapo is on their trail. That's another motivation for them to accelerate things. And when you think about trying to assassinate someone in the position of Hitler, this poses a lot of problems, right? He's never alone. He's surrounded by people who are loyal to him. There are security checks anytime that anyone's going to come into contact with him. And he spends most of his time, as we've already mentioned, in East Prussia, in this complex called the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, which means that even physically, access is somehow restricted to him. You could say, well, maybe we managed to smuggle a gun, who knows how, and somebody could shoot him. But there are fears that he might be wearing a bulletproof vest or something like that. That may or may not work. It's also hard to smuggle a gun in to his presence. I think there was some thought as to perhaps poisoning, but then, of course, a dictator is usually hard to poison because they have people to check. So the solution comes to a bomb, right? Which is also not an uncommon way to try to assassinate someone. You could have a timed bomb, or you could go kind of suicide bomb route, let's say, which an officer did try earlier in the war on Hitler, giving him a little guided tour of some military equipment. I think we mentioned that also in a previous episode, and that didn't work out. So the plan ends up with this timed bomb. But killing Hitler is only one part of this plot, right? They have to then carry out the rest of the coup d'etat. And carrying out a coup d'etat is also a tricky thing. So you mentioned you have to worry about communication. So you have to stop the people from communicating anything that's happening. But you then also have to communicate to the people that you need. Other officers who are involved are going to have to know, okay, it's go time. The plan is done. And the idea is, more or less, for the key people to end up in Berlin. So Stauffenberg is the one who ends up deciding, I'm going to be the one who puts the bomb in this meeting room in a briefcase. And then I'm going to fly to Berlin. And then it's on, right? And it's on means essentially seizing control of power. So not only is Hitler dead, but you have to make sure that your people take over. This is partly where the replacement army comes in, because there are units all across the country. You can say, you can't very easily sort of ancient Roman style, say I'm going to march the legion back to Rome and take power. It's a different context. You're not going to be marching someone back from the Eastern Front. You're going to use the replacement army, which is already in the heart of the country, right? So that's kind of more or less the bare bones. Stauffenberg's going to kill Hitler with a bomb. They're going to try to sever communications with anybody who, from the Nazi point of view, could prevent the coup d'etat. And then they're going to use the forces that are hopefully loyal to them, or at least the commanders that are loyal to them, say, hey, Hitler's dead. Your oath is gone, right? And now here's what we're doing. We're going to take over. So that's kind of more or less the very, very bare bones version. There were a couple of failed attempts, right? There was another officer, Helmut Stief, who said, okay, I'll do it. But then he got cold feet. This is a bit earlier in July. And on July 14th, Stauffenberg actually brought a bomb to a meeting. But then it turned out that Heinrich Himmler wasn't there, because originally they were like, well, we really should take out a couple, right? We should take out Himmler, we should take out Göring, and we should take out Hitler, preferably when they're all at the same meeting. And that didn't work out. Now, when you increase the variables like that, it makes your project a little more complicated. So they dropped that idea afterwards. But these are the kind of things that lead up to the big moment on July 20th when the plan is put into action. I've left a lot out. So Matthias, pick and choose the most important gaps that you want to fill in.
Well, I don't think there are many, to be perfectly honest. When we look at the plots, yes, obviously there were other plots before that, even before 1944. I think in the previous episode we talked about some of the other plots. You mentioned on the 14th, absolutely right. So not only do you want to take out Hitler, you want to take out the entire Nazi leadership, or as many as possible, because that's what you need to do. So that's why the 14th doesn't go ahead. He then tries to do the same thing on the 15th when this restriction had been lifted. As long as you can kill Hitler, that's good enough. But then when he goes in there, Hitler excuses himself and walks out, and so they can't blow him up. And that, of course, then leads, as you already said, to the 20th of July. And one of the reasons why they then go ahead with this again is because Stauffenberg had been told that the Gestapo, so the secret state police, was hot on their heels, and they knew there was something was happening, so it had to be done. They thought they were all going to be arrested very, very soon. So do whatever you need to do, and do it quickly. I mean, the whole thing about the pistol, I personally find really interesting. So in my eyes, this is probably the biggest failure of German general staff officers in their history, because at that stage, you were still allowed to take your pistol into the meeting room, because it's part of uniform. You take a pistol with you. I'm not quite sure where you're allowed to take ammunition, but you can always hide a bullet somewhere. So why not take the pistol and even say bulletproof vest, just shoot that person. Well, in the head, that's easy. Terribly sorry, dear listeners, but then you know you hit the right spot.
If you're standing across the table from them, it can be easy, but yeah.
But of course, you'd be sacrificing yourself. That's very obvious because, well, you wouldn't live another day. But there we are. So, but the fact that they don't do this and then instead go for this bomb, I always think you could have done that in a different way. It's only after the plot that it's then forbidden for anybody to take weapons in when they meet Hitler, which quite a few of the officers find quite upsetting, because they think, well, it's distrust and how dare he and all that kind of stuff. So it's another sub-story. But that then leads, of course, to the 20th of July. And when Stauffenberg comes, then he's got the bomb now with him. When he gets to Rastenburg again, he flies there on the 20th for another briefing. So he was a regular, what's the word I'm looking for?
Attendee,
yeah. So he was a regular attendee at these meetings because he was the chief of staff back in Berlin. So he was important. He was known. People knew his face. So he didn't have any problems getting in or something like this. He, of course, is shocked to see that the meeting had been moved, because normally it would take place in a bunker. And the bunker is brilliant when you want to blow up a bomb, because you've got lots of concrete around you. Now, the problem is that day, because it was a particular hot day, the briefing had been moved into some sort of wooden shed. And that, of course, is a bit of an issue when you think about the blast, as will happen. Again, there's a spoiler here for you, dear listeners. Of course, the blast goes somewhere else. The energy, the power doesn't stay within concrete walls. And of course, that's a problem. So he arrives there at around 12:30. The conference begins. Stauffenberg asks to use the washroom. He walks out and he then prepares the bomb. They're using British bombs because they're supposed to be the most accurate ones when it comes to a timer. The problem is that he's interrupted while he's doing this. He's quite slow at this because he's got one hand missing and he's only got two fingers on the other hand. So he's got special pliers to use. It all takes quite a long time. So he can only really set off one of these bombs and get them live. The other one he just puts back in the briefcase, walks into the briefing room, places the bomb underneath the table, tries to get it to Hitler as close as possible. But then, of course, the famous thing happens. What happens then, Jesse? What's the next thing that happens? What's the famous bit?
Well, yeah, the problem is he leaves his briefcase, but another officer who's attending the meeting by the name of Heinz Brandt moves the briefcase.
Exactly, yes.
Imagine of all the bureaucratic-related snafus that could screw up your historic coup d'etat against one of the worst dictators to ever walk the earth. Somebody shifting your briefcase messes it all up. So when it explodes, the force, as you say, it's not only diminished by the fact that you're not surrounded by 4 concrete walls, you're in a wooden building, but it's also being minimized or reduced by the heavy table leg that the briefcase was now up against. So this meeting table ends up absorbing more of the blast than it was planned to. And that is why Hitler survived, probably. I mean, of course, you never know what would happen if the briefcase hadn't been moved, but given what the bomb did in that room, one has to kind of think it would be likely that Hitler would have been killed or at least very, very severely wounded, because when the bomb goes off, it still kills 4 and wounds 20, despite these mitigating factors that we just talked about that kind of make the blast less powerful than it was supposed to be. Hitler's a bit wounded. Let's say he's injured a little bit. His eardrum is pierced. He gets some sort of irritation in his eye, I think, from the blast or dust or whatever. And I was going to say in North American English, his pants were singed and shredded. But British English speakers out there, his trousers were singed. I don't have the information on whether his British English pants were affected. That would be North American English underwear. I don't know, but his trousers were in any case shredded a little bit. That's how close Stauffenberg's bomb came in the end.
So all this happens. So Stauffenberg going into the this little wooden hut, you might say, and then he excuses himself at 12:30, puts the bomb there, and goes out. At 12:42, the bomb goes off. Massive explosion, as you already said. You talked about the consequences. Stauffenberg then more or less rushes out. Of course, there is alarm. First of all, people thought that it would have been an air raid, the bomb would have been dropped from above. Only later they discovered, well, no, that didn't happen because there was no air raid warning. He manages to bluff his way out of the area. He rushes to an airfield, which was in the vicinity. And by 1300 hours, he's on the plane on the way to Berlin. So everything so far seems to be going well, you might say. Hitler they think, is dead. Stauffenberg's on the way to Berlin, and in Berlin, things are already happening. So he thinks. Now, the problem is that Feldgiebel, I mentioned earlier, early on rings on his line, because he's in charge of the lines as a signal person, rings into Berlin to some of the members of the, let's call them the gang, of the group, and he said, you know what, something's happened, Hitler is still alive, I don't think he's dead. That causes confusion. And when Stauffenberg arrives in Berlin at 1600 hours, 4 p.m., he then rushes to the Bender block to find that basically nothing has really happened at that stage. And when he gets there, he has a massive fit and said, you've lost all this time, you've wasted all this time. Because regardless of what has happened, whether he's alive or not, you should have used these 3 hours or so to basically take over Berlin. And you haven't done this, and that is the huge problem. And this is where the plan comes in. This is why it's called Valkyrie, and that's why the film is called Valkyrie as well. Because the plan that they're trying to use is a plan that had been set up by the army and signed off by Hitler in case there would be a coup in Berlin. So you would then bring in all these troops that are stationed in the area of Berlin to make sure that the government area is protected, and you just arrest the people who are doing whatever, rising up against the regime or having some sort of plot. So they were trying to use this particular plan in their favor. Going to Berlin, saying, we now initiate Valkyrie, and what's happened is there's been an attack on Hitler, he's dead. We now need to arrest all these people who were involved in this, and this is mainly, it's the SS and other people, so take them all out. It also meant that very quickly you were supposed to take over the key locations in Berlin, like radio stations, for example, everything that's important for a coup like this. And all this was too slow, and that is the big, big problem. And what then happens is that a chap called Major Rehmer, who is in charge of the basically the Guards battalion in Berlin, he rushes into Berlin, is also confused just like everybody else. And he's given these orders to arrest all sorts of people, including the SS and other people, and Goebbels, because he's part of this so-called conspiracy as well, so arrest him. He then goes there, and it's the famous scene also from that film, where Goebbels then says, well, give me a line to Berlin, and he hands over the phone. It's Hitler at the other end. He said, Rehmer, do you recognize my voice? And he said, yes, mein Führer. He said, I'm not dead. It's some sort of coup. Just listen to me. No one else. Arrest everybody else. And you might say that at that particular stage, the coup has already failed. Stauffenberg and all the other people back and what have you, so the leaders, they now sit in the Bendler block. They're frantically trying to phone people, trying to make sure that areas within Germany are taken over, are seized, Berlin as well. But they're fighting a losing battle. And they realize that very, very quickly because of these issues, what they have. It is interesting to see there's one place where the coup actually works and where they take over, and that's Paris. Because in Paris, you have a chap called Stülpnagel, and he's the military commander of France, and he obviously sits in Paris, and he's part of this conspiracy. And when everything happens, and he's informed, and the green button is pressed, yes, go, he arrests all the SS and Gestapo and SD and all the organizations of the Nazi state. And so he's taken over, he's won. So France is in the hand of the Stauffenberg group, so to speak. Now you've got, of course, the big problem afterwards. What are you going to do? Because now Stauffenberg is gone, the coup is over. You've got this guy sitting in Paris. He's more or less won, but everyone knows the coup is over. So what do you do? So actually, he comes to an arrangement with all these people he just arrested. He says, well, let's face it, guys. Well, this looks bad for me. It also looks very bad for you guys because, well, you've just all been arrested. So let's come to some sort of arrangement. And they report back to Berlin that this had been an exercise. They were playing through exactly a scenario like this. So it's an exercise, and yes, exercise tick. We've released everyone again, and everything's fine. So should something happen, Paris is safe because we know what to do. So that's quite a funny story. In the end, of course, feet. Yeah, exactly. In the end, of course, it doesn't really help him because he then dies as well, and there we are. But it's if that's the right word, it's quite a funny story within the maelstrom of awfulness that you find on that particular day. And it's also neat to see the reaction of the regime then quite quickly. So you've got this confusion, but the moment they knew, okay, there's a plot going on here, we're going to close down Berlin. No one can move anywhere. My grandmother was in Berlin that particular day, actually, because she worked for the Air Force High Command, which was just on the outskirts of Berlin in the area of Potsdam. And that day she had to go from the Air Force High Command to the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht. So basically, practically, she had to go to the Bendler block, and she was on the S-Bahn, so basically a local train, so to speak, going from Potsdam to Berlin. And she said suddenly it was very confusing and very, very worrying because she just got on a Potsdam, and she said some stage in the afternoon, she couldn't really remember. Suddenly, they could see that all the doors were being locked. You had, at the last station, you had a number of military personnel jumping on trains, making sure that no one could get in or out again. And they just kept the trains going the entire day. They didn't stop. They were just going round and round and round. So no one could go on or off. And she said the one thing she remembers was all the military you could see on the train stations, making sure that these train stations were completely blocked and no one could use the train stations. So you can see, again, there's the reaction by the regime quite quickly, making sure that no one can move about and trying to completely shut down the city of Berlin. And in the end, they achieved this, and that, of course, means that the coup has failed. And then close to midnight, to cut a reasonably long story short, Stauffenberg and the main perpetrators like Ulbricht and Heften, they are then arrested in the Bendler block. And that's also an interesting one because the chap who's responsible there is a chap called Fromm, Generaloberst Fromm. So he's the senior guy. And they try to get him on board as well. And he said, well, I'm not quite sure, because he kind of, well, he's not sure, should he support them, should he not support them? So he's leaning towards them. He said, yes, if only if the pig were dead, I'd help you. But now I'm not quite sure if that's happened or not. So he's not quite sure what to do. And he has these guys then arrested. And by that stage, of course, he knows that Hitler is alive. So he is the one who then orders these guys shot rather than arrest them and put them on trial. And one of the arguments or reasons why he's doing that is exactly how convenient, so they can't talk. And there is the story that as they're lined up in the courtyard of the Bendler block, that he's standing up on the balcony smoking cigarettes, overseeing the whole process until they're all dead. And that happens shortly after midnight, at just before 1 o'clock, something like that, on the 21st of July. And they're all lined up, so the leading perpetrators, and shot, with the one big exception, that's Ludwig Beck, who's also there in the Bendler block. And so he is he's condemned to death by Fromm himself. He says, well, this is now the trial. You're all sentenced to death, and that's it. And Beck says, well, for old friendship's sake, just give me a pistol, I'll do it myself. Goes to the next room, shoots himself. Again, you think, well, here's a 4-star general, at least, forgive me, listeners, at least be able to shoot yourself properly, because he's not, because he shoots himself in the head, but he does it the wrong way. But basically, he shoots himself, but he survives, he's blind. So then someone else, a non-commissioned officer, goes there and gives him the coup de grace and shoots him in the neck, and then he's dead as well. So, and that's the end, you might say, of this particular plot. Rushing a little bit, because there are all sorts of little interesting facets and aspects, but I think the bigger picture stuff, that's it. Now it's for me to say, Jesse, what have I left out? What have I forgotten? Where do we take it from here?
I think that's a pretty good summary of how things went down. I think it's quite interesting how, from the get-go, there's chaos. So it not only does Hitler survive, I mean, this is kind of an accident in a way that he survives, but they're not able to implement their plan, partly because the communication goes wrong. So you have Stauffenberg, who immediately phones when he arrives in Berlin and says, Hitler's dead. But then there's also just been a message from East Prussia saying Hitler's alive. And so you have people like Fromm, who kind of sort of switch sides, or General Lindemann was supposed to show up and read the big radio announcement about, this has happened and everybody, we're under new management, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't show up. And then you have von Kluge in the West, who, when he learns that Hitler is alive, says, yeah, that none of this is happening. So there's this kind of parallel reaction. You have a core that still wants to do it because they're committed. And then you have a bunch of people who were kind of into it, but now they're backing out, or now they're not showing up, or what have you. So this is not a recipe for pulling off the kind of operation that they're trying to pull off. So I do think the aftermath is also interesting. What they do, they search, obviously, then a lot of the Nazis do, and their police and so on, search all sorts of people's homes, documents. Then they find out about some previous attempts that they didn't know about before. So this increases the sort of paranoia of the regime, right? The Nazi rule becomes much harsher inside Germany for Germans and for its own military than it had been before. It's a real sort of turning point. They introduce new types of military police, for example, soon after that are responsible for, pretty harsh and criminal discipline in the army that they do in the last year of the war. I think they arrest about 7,000 people and they execute about 5,000 or almost 5,000. Obviously, there are not 7,000 people who were involved directly in this plot. I think about 200 of the executed were really conspirators, so to speak. One of the arrests, by the way, Franz Halder, another very, very big name, right? Former high-ranking commander. But they use it also to settle scores. You can see how this dictatorship, in a crisis, the answer is always more power, more repression. Who else can we repress that we didn't like now that this crisis has come? And of course, it's show trials where you have, I forget his name, but there's a somewhat well-known fanatical Nazi who was one of the quote unquote judges who was
Freisler. Freisler.
Who was, screaming insults at the defendants. And so as you can see, it's a total mockery. That is what the conspirators did not want in the justice system. They said rule of law and independence of the courts in their aspirational program that they had, that we talked about a bit in the other episode. So it all went sideways from the beginning. They also replaced the traditional military salute with exclusively the Nazi salute, which is, again, so you're strengthening your grip on society. In the end, the failure probably contributed to the length of the war in a it's hard to say that, but in a little bit of a way, because the terror of the German state towards its own army and its own population increases, and that makes it more likely that some institution is going to hold it together until the bitter end, which is more or less how things went down. As far as Tresco is concerned, we spoilered him a little bit that he finds out, he's out east, right? He finds out and he kills himself. Before he does that, allegedly, he says something very meaningful, I think, to a comrade of his, who is the source for this quote that I'm about to read out. So this other officer, I've forgotten his name, but he is the one who sort of says, hey, Tresco told me this before he went out and killed himself. So a couple of days before. So on the cusp of the actual events. He says, the whole world will vilify us now, but I am still totally convinced we did the right thing. Hitler is the arch enemy not only of Germany, but of the world. When in a few hours' time I go before God to account for what I have done and left undone, I know I will be able to justify what I did in the struggle against Hitler. None of us can bewail his own death. Those who consented to join our circle put on the robe of Nessus. The robe of Nessus, by the way, it's a Greek mythology reference. It's a poisoned shirt that Hercules wore. So that's quite the confident comparison there, let's say. And then he goes on to finish off. A human being's moral integrity begins when he is prepared to sacrifice his life for his convictions. So here again, we have a very, very meaningful, very strong statement. It's crystal clear about his conscience, about morality. And that's one of the admirable things about many of the people in this involved in this movement, this resistance movement.
Absolutely. Yes, very true. And the man he said these words to was a chap called Fabian von Schlapperendorf. I mean, for the listeners, if you want to Google him, again, interesting CV. You might say fits this bill quite nice, or the story that when the picture we painted about all these individuals here. So after the coup, so he's basically the liaison officer, you might say, between Tresco and some people in Berlin. So he's a lieutenant at the stage. He's then also arrested. He's interrogated. He's put in front of the courts. And again, it is Freisler who's supposed to judge him and to sentence him. But then there is a bomb that falls on the court building, and all sorts of stuff happen there. That's quite interesting. So that, as far as I remember, does that even kill Freisler? No, I think he dies somewhere else, but I'm not quite sure if it's in this incident that he dies. But basically, that's how Schlapperendorf, in a way, is spared, and then he survives and to live another day and another life after 1945. But when he is imprisoned, he gets in touch, or he comes together with all these famous people. Again, we don't have time to go into detail, but for example, Wilhelm Canaris is there. He was the head of German intelligence, so a Navy guy. Hans Oster, he was the man who in the early days had given plans to the German invasion plans of 1940, for example, to the Western Allies. Ulrich von Hassel, he was a diplomat. Karl Goerdeler, so he is one of the politicians he had. and lots of other people. So again, you can see it's a broad church that you find here. And when you look at people who die, perhaps particularly in the military context, particularly to our listeners from the English-speaking world, obviously the most famous one, or probably not obviously, is Rommel, Erwin Rommel. So he's a victim of this too. So he is visited by two German generals, and they say, we know that you took part in this plot. And there's still a big debate amongst historians whether he knew, whether he didn't know, whether he supported or not. But they said, no, someone gave us your name, so we know you were involved. Some people have argued afterwards that it was his former adjutant Speidel who was tortured and then spoke out. Speidel, who has a very stellar career after World War II, becomes a 4-star general. So some people have suggested that. I think it's not 100% clear and certain, but there we are. So they say, we know you were involved, so you've got two options now. The first one is we're going to take you back to Berlin and you're going to be sentenced there. At the People's Court, that's the term, the Volksgerichtshof, and that means, of course, you're going to get found guilty and you're going to get executed, and that's the end of you and basically your family too. Or alternatively, here is the little pill, so basically just bite it. That's the poison, and you get a state funeral, and very important, your wife and children, well, your wife and son will be looked after, and you get your state pension and a state funeral. So he goes for that option. He knows he's going to do this as he walks out of the door, says goodbye to his wife and his son. I mean, that must be a pretty strange, awful feeling. Now, you're never going to see them again. Gets in the car, bites the ampule, and basically a few seconds later, he's dead. So that's another victim. And of course, what you also find, in addition to these people who were sentenced by Friesland, the Volksgerichtshof, you have a very nasty scene and incident in Plötzensee. Plötzensee is a part of Berlin, and there's a prison. It's now a memorial. You can go and visit it because that was the traditional execution place of Berlin. And so a number of people who were sentenced to death in the early days were brought to Plötzensee, not just to be, as was customary in those days, to be beheaded, but they came up with a very nasty idea. And basically, it was a bit like a swing. So you had a piece of wood up on the ceiling on some sort of swinging device. And then you would put a very thin wire around your neck. And then they would hang, 5 or 6 people up on this board at a time. And the really, really awful thing about this was that it was just high. Well, it was high enough that the swing, the board was up. You wouldn't be able to touch the floor. However, if you were down, you could touch the floor just about. So if you're on your toes, you could touch it, and you could see that basically like a swing. People were just trying to stay alive, just jumping up and down all the time, and that was actually filmed. And there are accounts and reports from numerous people that after the 20th of July, for a long time, Hitler would just sit there in the evenings all by himself and watch the execution of these people, and time and again and time and again and time and again. The films don't have survived, so we don't know really it's true, but because we have accounts from a number of people, it probably was true. We know that happened because the device is still there. So again, should you go to Berlin, dear listeners, make sure you stop at Plötzensee and have a look at this really, really nasty device that they came up with to make death as awful and painful and long as possible, which again tells you quite a bit about that particular regime, I would say.
Yes, and it also tells us, I think, something about these officers who were willing to risk such a fate in order to try to oppose it. I don't know. Maybe I'm like a broken record, but to me, this is what stays with me the most is this very difficult but meaningful decision and the power of those convictions. Like that quote from Tresco before he killed himself. I mean, he basically says, I understand that I'm done for, but it was worth it anyway, because, there's a higher reason for trying to oppose this evil. And not everybody can come to that conclusion. And even if they come to that conclusion at the expense maybe of their career, of power, of prestige, of whatever the choice is in that situation, even if they come to the conclusion that it's bad, to then actively risk your own life against it is another step entirely, which is one that most people are not willing to do if history is our guide, or if today's politics as well in different places is our guide. So that to me is one of those overarching things, and the element that I probably take with me the most when it comes to the July plot. We've now spent 2 episodes going through the genesis of the plan, the so-called plotters, how it panned out, why it went wrong, and some of these bigger picture questions about oaths, about loyalty, about morals, about ethics. Interesting, by the way, that Tresco mentions God. So that's another source of his moral compass. Nazis famously not super big on religion. So that's another interesting contrast of value systems. Do you have anything else on your list, Matthias? Do you have any other points that we want to leave the listeners with in our discussion of the July plot before we wrap it up?
Maybe just a very short one. And I always say that, and then the point is not short, but I try to keep it very short.
Before,
exactly. It never happens. But just, again, the legacy of this. We talked about it, the changing perception. But it is interesting in this context, everything you just said about the morals and all these things that we discussed and you just brought up again. It is interesting to see that in the German military of today, the 20th of July plot is one of the 3 pillars of tradition. So this is something that is in contrast to what I said earlier about the 1950s and 60s, and so these are all traitors and what have you. So the view is now completely different. So you've got 3 pillars of tradition. The one is the history of the German army after the Second World War. You've got the People's War in 1813 to 15 against Napoleon, which probably, apart from the spotters and the military historians and the nerds, doesn't mean anything to anybody anymore, to be perfectly honest. And you've got the 20th of July. So it's one of the 3 pillars of tradition. That in itself just shows you how important the memory of all this is to modern Germany and in particular to the military. And of course, they chose this particular one because, as we now explained and looked at in quite some depth and detail, this is not an exclusively military attempt, but it is overwhelmingly military, and the military are in the driving seat, and that's why they obviously chose this one, and because it is the one got closest to killing Hitler. And wouldn't the world have been a different place if that had happened?
Oh man, yeah, that's an alternate history.
Oh yes,
that's been. I'm sure there have been novels and things written about it before, but yeah. Maybe that's the food for thought that we'll leave our listeners with for today. We hope that, we hope that you enjoyed and also learned something about the July plot, which is famous, but at the same time is nonetheless deserving of, I think, a 2-episode treatment, especially with a look at some of the topics that we talked about, some of the concepts and some of the individual people. So if you like what you've been hearing from us, you can support the podcast directly. You can make sure that we're able to do this kind of thing and keep doing it. You can do that at our website, bothsidesofthewire.com. And you can even get access to exclusive content. It's not on the normal episodes that are publicized, that are publicly available, I should say. That's in our war room. You can get a free trial access to that by using the code DeepDarkWoods. Even though I kind of think we might have to change the code in the future to Here Come the Tangents or Frederick the Great.
I think so, yes.
Something along those lines. So that's it, folks. Thanks for being with us, and we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
The self-esteem, everything that comes with these Linus cut it out. With these traditions, so where would I start? Where do I go from that? I can't remember. Linus, help me. I'm not quite sure where I am.
I don't remember either.
I remember
Aristocratic
either.
traditions is what you were going to
Yeah.
say, but what came before exactly?
I don't know. I've got no idea.